Welcome. My name is Patrick Grande, and today's podcast will be discussing the topic of mass incarceration. We will take an in-depth look at the issues and effects of mass incarceration for high school students like us and those who are incarcerated. So what I want to do first is set a definition for what mass incarceration is. And then I want to dive into why I chose it as my topic and why I think it is an important issue to discuss and advocate for. So firstly, you may have heard the term mass incarceration before, and it refers to the fact that the United States is the leading country in incarceration and prison populations. We incarcerate more than 2 million people. And according to the Montana Innocence Project, our population makes up less than 5% of the world's population, but our inmates make up nearly 25% of the world's inmate population. In fact, the U.S. prison population has increased 500% in the past 40 years. Now, America has not always had extremely high rates of incarceration. Instead, it began when President Richard Nixon pushed the tough on crime and war on drugs rhetoric. This rhetoric has since then changed into policy, which has then increased the rate of incarceration. I think that some of the most important policies and regulations to look at are the exorbitant bail policy, in which nearly 500,000 people sit in prison at any given time waiting for trial because they are unable to pay bail and be released to await trial instead. Research has shown that people awaiting trial who are not in jail are less likely to be convicted and less likely to be imprisoned if they are convicted. Another thing is mandatory minimum sentencing. These laws dictate minimum sentences for whether it be drug or other crimes, and it disallows judges the ability to account for individual circumstances. Another thing is the 3 strikes law. These laws mandate a sentence of 25 years to life after a conviction for a 3rd felony. And I think the main component of how the incarceration rates have risen over the past decades is the war on drugs. In today's society, nearly 50% of incarcerated people in the federal system are in prison for drug offenses, and 2/3 of that population are people of color. When I read this statistic, it was really shocking and disheartening to see how it was disproportionately affecting, marginalized and unfortunate groups. And in this case, it happens to be people of color. And this section of what changed the rates and how it causes them to rise is kind of what leads me into why I chose this topic. Beginning of the pandemic, when the whole situation surrounding George Floyd occurred, it was during this time that hundreds of protests across the country were happening. It was being displayed all over the media, and I began to pay a lot more attention to what was happening. And eventually I was able to go to a Black Lives Matter protest myself in Kirkwood during the summer of 2020. I was really moved by this, and it propelled me to begin advocating for more social justice topics regarding racial issues. This became a pretty big part of my life. I would consistently discuss and argue topics such as incarceration with my friends in person and on social media. I even wrote multiple supplemental essays for my college admissions on this topic and how it has affected me in today's society. So when I heard that we were doing a project on advocacy, my mind immediately went to social justice. Incarceration was a topic I did not have as much knowledge on, so I chose that to give me a better opportunity to learn. So when I originally started researching this topic, I began to realize that many policies instituted by former administrations had disproportionately affected people of color. A shocking 1 in 3 Black children will at some point in their lives be incarcerated. After reading statistics like that, I was really inspired to try to figure out more about why this was happening and how people like us can make a change and how others are advocating and making changes. So I reached out to Lacey Parker. She is a criminal defense attorney and also instructs the criminal defense clinic at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. So I set up a phone call with her and asked her a couple questions regarding mandatory minimum sentences and how this has affected people of color. And so here is that. So how was this clinic started, and what made you want to be a part of it?
So I don't actually know how the clinic got started. Mr. Williamson would be better able to answer that if you get a chance to speak with him. He was involved somewhat, much more in the beginnings of the clinic, which is quite a long time ago now. I've been practicing for 16 years, and it's been certainly running that whole time, but I don't know much about the origins of it. But as far as wanting to be a part of it, my previous boss, who is now the prosecuting attorney for the county of Albemarle, was the clinical director, and then when he was elected to become a Commonwealth attorney, it didn't make sense for him to be teaching at the defense clinic, and asked me if I wanted to do it, and the law school agreed. So I had already been a supervising attorney, so the way the clinic works is there's a clinical director, and then there are supervising attorneys, and the supervising attorneys oversee the day-to-day things that students are doing with clients and being in court and things like that. And then the director obviously knows what's going on with that, but does the more direct classroom part of things. And so I've been in both roles. I've been a lecturer for 3 years now, and then I've been a supervising attorney for longer than that.
Okay, great. And can you describe generally what the clinic does?
Yeah, so the students involved in the clinic have an opportunity to represent clients in 3 misdemeanor cases. The way that they are able to do that is that when you're in your 3rd year of law school, if you have taken certain requirements, so professional responsibility requirements and ethics requirements, you can become what is called 3rd year practice certified.
Okay.
Students that are 3rd year practice certified can practice under the supervision of an attorney that is barred and in good standing in the state of Virginia. And so these students each get assigned 3 misdemeanor cases to basically handle as attorneys. And I do the case assignments. The cases come to our office, so everybody, it's hard to sort of get into the clinic without sort of tying it into the public defender's office, but everybody that is indigent in a place where there's a public defender office in Virginia is supposed to be appointed to the public defender's office unless there's a conflict. So all the cases that come from the courts to our office, I can look at and then pick out things that I think would be good cases for clinic students to handle.
Awesome. So who are the people that you typically defend during the course, and do you have any specific cases that stick out to you that you remember more vividly?
So the people that we're representing are people that are indigent within the definition of the Virginia rules that allow them to be appointed an attorney.
Okay.
And that's anybody that meets that criteria, and they are charged with misdemeanors. And they are charged with misdemeanors that carry the possibility of a jail sentence, which are only Class 1 and Class 2 misdemeanors. There are very, very few Class 2 misdemeanors. Most misdemeanors that carry jail are Class 1 misdemeanors and carry the possibility of up to 1 year in jail. So anything that's just a fine or anything like that would not come through the clinic.
Okay.
And as far as cases that I vividly remember from the clinic, they're all pretty varied. We try to pick things that are interesting to the students. So I'm trying to think if anybody had there have been some good trials and things. But I would say that the ones that are most meaningful are the ones that have outcomes that really mean a lot to the clients. So yeah, it's fun to have a win, but cases where the clients just really worry about collateral consequences, like they're going to lose an apartment or lose a driver's license, and we're able to do something to help them with that, tend to be the most meaningful ones. But there's no specific case facts that sort of stick out in my mind.
Awesome. So how has the American criminal justice system affected the clients that the clinic has worked with?
Heavily. So it's significant. Often, because these are misdemeanor cases, we may be representing somebody that has absolutely no experience with the criminal legal system and has not had any contact before. So it's a very overwhelming process for them. It's scary. They don't really understand a lot of aspects of what the system is like. and feel really jerked around by it and caught off guard by it. And of course, we also represent people that are very familiar with the criminal legal system because, a number of the problems with the criminal legal system are that once you sort of are involved, it's very hard to extricate yourself from it. I'm sure you've seen that in some of what you've been looking at. So we definitely have clients that are more familiar with procedure and court than even the students in the clinic are. They know what to expect. They know the judge because they've appeared in front of the judge a number of times. So I think the thing that I find most affects people at the level where we're representing them is that it is very much the entry point of becoming entangled in something that's very hard to get yourself out of, because there are court costs that are associated with being involved in the system. You have a criminal record, which is going to have collateral consequences. Luckily, it doesn't do this anymore, but there used to be, if you didn't pay your court costs, your driver's license got suspended. But one of the other things that happens to a lot of clients that get convicted or have negotiated plea outcomes is that they may be referred to services that are overseen by the court. So things like mental health services, substance use services, or simply probation. So it just really costs them a lot in terms of time, and costs them a lot in terms of money. So it's rare for clients at this level to have to pay money bonds, so they haven't generally paid to be released on bail. But they may well have an oversight requirement from a community probation agency. So just that sort of the eye watching you aspect of it is beginning at this stage of things for a lot of our clients.
Okay, awesome. So have you had any cases that had minimum sentences, and what are your thoughts on laws that require minimum sentences?
So the clinic, there are very few mandatory minimums and misdemeanors in Virginia. There are a couple having to do with larceny. Our two jurisdictions that we work with they never charge the larcenies in the way that requires the mandatory minimums. So we haven't dealt with those. We see them quite a lot on cases with driving under the influence of alcohol. Those have mandatory minimums if you have a particularly elevated blood alcohol level. And then it used to be that there were mandatory minimums for certain driving without a license. Well, there still are. If you're driving on a suspended driver's license for the third or subsequent time, there's a 10-day mandatory minimum. And then the other place that they come into play is violation of a protective order. So if somebody has a protective order against another person and that person is alleged to have violated it by making contact or, texting them or having some kind of contact that they're not supposed to have, there's a mandatory minimum of 1 day in jail. My general thoughts on any laws, including at the felony level, which aren't part of the clinic, are that mandatory minimum sentences are pretty meaningless. I think the reason they exist is that there's a false notion that they deter criminal behavior, and I don't think that's the case at all. I think deterrence is something of a myth in our criminal legal system.
All right, so how do you think mandatory minimum sentences and rhetoric like tough on crime have affected people of color in America? And do you have any thoughts on how we could change these negative effects? If any.
Yeah, so they're obviously extremely negative. The fact, there's a lot to unpack in that question, right? So because of the disproportionate minority contact that police have, that means that more people of color in the United States end up involved in the criminal legal system proportional to what they represent in our communities. One of the ways that has been really detrimental to them with mandatory minimum sentences is I think it really diminishes people's ability to really have their day in court. Because one of the ways, so I don't want to give you too much background, but 98, I think at the federal level 98%, and at the state level in Virginia 96% of cases cases resolved through plea negotiation.
Okay.
So that means that most people don't have a trial. Most people negotiate away their trial in return for a set benefit that they know ahead of time. That benefit might be lesser charges. That benefit might be a lighter sentence.
Okay.
So mandatory minimum sentences are a huge weapon for prosecutors because while it doesn't make a big difference at the misdemeanor level, at the felony level, when you can prosecute somebody and say, if you don't take a plea, I'm going to bring a charge that has a mandatory minimum of 10 years in prison,
Wow.
then a person's desire to have a trial basically goes out the window because when the choice is between I can do 1 or 2 years plus probation versus I know I'm going to prison for 10 years, their right to really try the evidence in their case ends up being chilled by that. So that is, so that's sort of connecting some dots because people of color are more apt to have contact with the police, they end up being the ones that are more disproportionately sort of affected by that. We don't have disparity the way you've probably learned about in the federal court about the disparity between like crack cocaine, what it was like for crack cocaine versus powder cocaine. So that didn't exist in Virginia. So there wasn't that very clear line about how people of color were being affected. But there's nevertheless a nexus between those things. And as far as changing the negative effects, actually the Virginia legislature did some really wonderful things to try and do this. And the new legislature is going to try and undo all of it. So last year they passed some legislation that eliminated a lot of the bases for what are termed in the law as pretextual stops. They're not really pretextual, right? Like the police officer can come up with a reason, right? And those were reasons like having a third brake light out, having something hanging from your rearview mirror, like a hang tag, or fuzzy dice or something like that. There were a whole bunch of things like that police officers routinely used to stop people that they quote unquote suspected of other things. And so it's pretextual because there's a legitimate reason for the stop under the law. You're allowed to stop somebody for having fuzzy dice hanging off their rearview mirror. But as you can imagine, the way that police officers actually invoked that was by pulling over people of color that they wanted to pull over and search their vehicles. So when the legislature eliminated all of those reasons as a basis for pulling people over, that really helped eliminate the opportunity for police officers that were being racist when they were pulling people over to try and legally justify what they were doing. So that was a big step in the right direction. They are trying to undo it. So that's tough. The other thing that is really helpful that is also potentially sort of up in the air is using the legalization of marijuana and the elimination of odor of marijuana as a basis for whether or not a police officer can conduct a search. Because as you can imagine, once again, it's that pretextual, really race is the reason, but they know they're not supposed to say that, so instead they pretend, I smelled what I thought to be an odor of marijuana. So, which was quite subjective. So eliminating that was also a big step in the right direction.
Okay, great. So what do you think is the importance of advocating and defending indigent people in our current society?
I think it's monumental. I'm sure you've either read or heard about the new Jim Crow. Our criminal legal system at this point is a mechanism to control people and to keep a government eye on people of color in our society. And so making sure that those people's rights are not trampled and that we keep as many people out of that system as possible, to me, is the only way that I can do within the system to fight back against that kind of oppression.
Okay, awesome. So has the clinic impacted you in how you approach your own criminal defense practice at all?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that's been nice for me in teaching the clinic is that seeing everything I've practiced for 16 years. You get a little jaded. The way it sort of feels like a meat grinder sometimes because, like I said, most cases end with plea negotiations. So having students look at things with fresh eyes and seeing through their eyes what could be issues that perhaps I have not been raising as much or advocating about as strongly as they do, just because I sort of know what the outcome's going to be. Mm-hmm. It's nice to be reminded that those are important aspects. And the other thing that they always do is remind me of how important the personal connection is with our clients. Mm-hmm. My practice as a public defender is I have very high caseloads. So I have over 100 cases at any given time. Mm-hmm. These students all have 3 cases. So seeing the ability that they have to dedicate a lot of time to clients and how meaningful that is to clients always reminds me that when I can, not to be dismissive of clients or to do more hand-holding than really what my practice allows me to do. Because I see over and over again how meaningful it is to clients. Clients that even have, frankly, bad outcomes, which actually doesn't happen that much with the clinic. Like, we usually achieve one of their goals. But let's say it's even a client that's going to go serve some jail time. Mm-hmm. They are grateful because they know, based on how much time, attention, and response they got from the student, they know the student did their best. And so that's always inspirational to me and a good reminder to me to make sure that I'm showing the client how much work I'm doing on their behalf.
Okay, great. Can you share any specifics on how you teach your students to advocate for, like, the less fortunate clients you defend?
It's a whole semester-long process. Mm-hmm. We look at things like you're asking about, like institutional racism. One of the main things that we talk about quite a lot, well, 2 main things that we talk about quite a lot are mental illness and substance use disorders, because those drive, I couldn't put a percentage on it, but the vast majority of cases in the criminal legal system that I see and that they will defend relate in some way to either of those 2 things. So understanding those and the resources that people desperately need in our society for those are a big part of helping the students understand and advocate for clients. And I think one of the things that always changes for them from, say, the beginning of the semester till the end is that I think they have an idea in the beginning, some of them have an idea in the beginning that people are committing criminal acts with sort of this idea of being criminals. That they are thinking to themselves, I'm going to go shoplift at Walmart today or something like that. Yeah. And by the end of the term, they generally have gotten to know their clients and know the circumstances that led to a criminal behavior if there was one, and have a better understanding that the person is more than that crime that they committed, that there were circumstances that led them down that path that are sad circumstances and that speak much more to a fundamental failing in our society than they speak to somebody that sits around sort of rubbing their hands together thinking, time for me to go shoplift at Walmart. And it's more about having untreated trauma or a substance use disorder that they need help with or something like that.
Okay, and finally, is there any way a high school senior could advocate for individuals like your clients?
So that's a pretty hard question, because there are so many disparate parts of the criminal legal system. So each piece is sort of small and discrete, and it's hard to find something overall that would help people. But to the degree that there are volunteer opportunities, so there are things, some of the things that affect our clients the most are, like I said, mental illness and substance use disorder, and that one of the things that most often leads to them having problems when they are trying to improve those aspects of their lives are stable housing. So to the degree that you know of any organizations like shelters and advocacy groups that work to help people secure housing would just be huge. And it would be tangential. You wouldn't be working directly with clients, but you would be making a big difference in your community that would help everybody in your community, because without stable housing, there's just no way for any person to be a successful person in life, let alone somebody that has whatever strikes against them, like a major mental illness, or a substance use disorder. So I would say, in Charlottesville, Pachem operates during the winter months to help people that don't have anywhere warm to stay. Volunteering with something like that just does a lot to promote community stability overall, and especially to help individuals like my clients.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome. Well, I hope that your project goes well, and I hope you continue in this interest. And, depending on where your career path leads, keep me in mind and stay in touch. You're always welcome to come shadow at our office or find out more. Or if it leads to law school, you're welcome to be an intern here. So we're always looking for people that are interested in our system and interested in public defense.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Take care.
All right, bye.
So I think that this interview was really helpful in allowing me to take a deep dive into what is our criminal justice system and how, the details and the intricacies can affect people in a way we wouldn't even recognize. So I want to go over some of the things that I found to be really interesting from the interview, and basically the things that really stuck out to me. So first, I liked how she talked about how it was, very difficult to extricate yourself or free yourself. And many of the clients she had worked with in the past had no previous experience with the law and, the very detailed procedures that go along with court cases and fines. She mentioned how it can be incredibly overwhelming and scary for these people, and it made me think about how important it is for people like herself to be outlets for them and to be able to assist their needs. Now, not all of us can be criminal defense attorneys, but I think it is important to realize that students not much older than us are able to make a difference through this course, and there are many options and opportunities like this throughout the country. So another interesting thing I found was when she was talking about the mandatory minimum sentences. She mentioned how she thought they were pretty meaningless. And I was surprised by this. And she also talked about how the notion that these are meant to deter crime behavior, but they just really don't do that, which was really shocking to me and, made me wonder why they are still in place if they're really not making a difference, and what is the real reason behind having these. She said that deterrence in our criminal justice system is pretty much a myth, and this was really interesting to hear because I think it points out how these laws really need to be changed because it is hurting marginalized community greatly without having any real effect on the crime rates themselves. She also mentioned how mandatory minimums are being used as a weapon by prosecutors to force people into a plea bargain. Like she mentioned, you might have a crime you've committed, and with the mandatory minimum, you would be sentenced to 10 years when you could be getting out of it, but you have to take a plea instead because it's either take the plea or go to jail for 10 years for something that, may not require or meet the standard of 10 years. So I was shocked by this, and I really realized how much of a dangerous tactic this can be. And it clearly shows that mandatory minimums are not doing what they are intended to do, and clearly shows that there is a need for change within these laws. Moving on now, what I found to be most interesting about the clinic itself is how the students have had a great impact on her practice as a defense attorney. And I think that it just goes to show how big of a change and impact people like us, like young people, college students, high school seniors, high school students in general, can make impacts on adults who have prolific careers and impressive resumes. And just because we're in high school doesn't necessarily mean that we aren't able to make an impact and make a change on bigger issues that we may think we don't have any control over. Now, that's not to say that we are able to end issues like mass incarceration all by ourselves, but she talks about how you can do small things like helping with mental health clinics, or volunteering in other ways, and it can really help those in need. So although we might not all be criminal defense attorneys in the future, we all have the ability to make change. And I found this to be really powerful because as a high school senior, it seems hard to believe that this is even possible. But Mrs. Parker allowed me to see that every little thing can make a difference, and I want to strive to make that difference in our community and in the country.
I want to thank you for listening to my podcast. I hope I was able to give some good insight on the topic of mass incarceration specifically and its effects on society. And I hope I was able to show you that high school senior or students in general are able to make a change and can help in ways that you may not have known about. I hope that you take this podcast and use it as inspiration for making change in whatever you see fit, whatever drives you, whatever you're passionate in, whether it be mass incarceration or anything else. So yeah, thank you.